Radio for Christians. This is 990 WDEO.
You will not believe the story that you're going to hear from my guest today on Church and Culture. Mark Riebling has just published a book, Church of Spies, The Pope's Secret War Against Hitler, which I'm calling a must-read for all Catholics. It reads beautifully, it's beautifully written, and it tells a story that we haven't heard. It's also a call to heroism for all Catholics and for all Christians in the face of evil, in the face of death. I know I felt it. It had a great impact on me. And Mark is a very well-known expert in intelligence, counterterrorism. His book for Knopf, entitled Wedge, How the Secret War Between the CIA and the FBI Has Endangered National Security, has become a more or less accepted classic on the various issues between the police and espionage agencies. Mark, welcome to Church and Culture.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I want to get to this amazing book that you've written, and I'm sure that our listeners realize that over the past 10 years or so, there's been a lot of criticism leveled at Pius XII, and it's basically having to do with his silence on the Jews, on the Shoah, on the Holocaust, which, of course, is a question you raise at the heart of your book. But I must say that as I read your book, and I read it at one sitting, I felt like you were almost rewriting the history of the Catholic Church during the World War II era, in the sense that you were bringing so much new information and untold stories to the narrative that people just haven't heard. Do you think that's fair? I know it's praise, but do you think it's a fair thing to say?
If I didn't think it was fair, I would have kept working on the book and thought it was fair. But I would say, and also by way of perhaps complimenting, even if in a backhanded way, some of those who would disagree with me, I think where my book fits into the overall vast literature on this very controversial Pope is, I would say that literature that's very critical of the Pope is not so much incorrect as very incomplete. Despite a billion words in published English, very, very, very little had been done on the Pope's contacts with the German resistance, certainly nothing at book form, even though some of the fiercest critics, such as John Cornwell, who wrote Hitler's Pope, or Daniel Jonah Goldhagen, James Carroll, Gary Wills, they all admit in a phrase or a sentence or a paragraph that Pius XII hated Hitler and did conspire to remove him. But to me, they showed a dramatic lack of curiosity about what the Pope actually did,
to say the least,
to what he did not say. And so I just felt like the better point of fairness is to consider this story from beginning to end, and just state what the facts and records say, and let readers make up their own mind about where this leaves Pius XII in the verdict of history.
I'm reminded as I read your incredibly interesting narrative of this. And I put on my personal Facebook page this morning, what you've outlined here is a intelligence network which was involved in bringing information from Nazi-controlled Germany and the various countries that it conquered, right to Pope Pius XII in his apartment. And in all these communications, he insisted that it be addressed to him and from him and not from the Vatican. He wanted to distinguish his work in this effort from the Vatican, so he would be, personally responsible. And also the several different efforts, I think 3, to try to actually assassinate him, to commit what you talk about as tyrannicide, which was resisted by the German Protestants but pushed by the German Catholics. I think you have the phrase, Catholics trod where Protestants deferred, or something like that.
Feared to tread.
Feared to tread. And it was, and also you point out that Bonhoeffer, and when I went to Princeton Theological Seminary back in the 70s, Bonhoeffer was a great hero because he was the guy, the one minister of the word who tried to bring down Hitler. But you point out that Bonhoeffer was brought into this whole effort by Benedictines.
I guess he was, and he was lodged in this monastery called Ettal in the Bavarian Alps, a Bavarian monastery, and there if you read Bonhoeffer's letters, you get in very granular detail his great pleasure at being so well received by the clergy at the monastery, the brothers, how they were reading aloud from his work on ethics, which was then in the process of...
Which I read in seminary, by the way.
A very important work. And
yes.
Bonhoeffer then makes changes. One is he moves from passive and nonviolent resistance to active and violent resistance, at least in the form of conspiracy. And that's, many believe, and I believe, due to the direct influence of the Jesuits with whom he was in contact at this time, especially Father Rupert Mayer, a very famous Munich Jesuit who used to go to the Munich railway station and offer a quick mass so that people could take the sacraments before they went hiking in the Bavarian Alps on Sunday, which is a very Bavarian kind of thing. He had a great influence, Father Mayer, on...
And they were using Aquinas as a source for their justification for tyrannicide, correct?
They were, and especially Aquinas as filtered through Jesuit theologians of the Counter-Reformation. And, there had been some controversy over this, and during the 19th century, when the Church was trying to project a different image to the world, one which secular powers were not so enthusiastic about attacking during the rise of nationalism, a lot of these interpretations had been sort of set aside, and Emmanuel Saw, a Spanish Jesuit, his works on tyrannicide were even put on the index of prohibited books. But in 1901, Pope Leo XIII very quietly removed this Jesuit work on tyrannicide from the index, and that was just as Eugenio Pacelli of the future Pope Pius XII joined the Vatican Foreign Service. So there was an updating, or at least a going back in certain ways to these old doctrines, which did, as you point out, prove very useful during the time where Protestants and Catholics had to come together and form a united front against Hitler, Bonhoeffer being probably the signal influence, or the signal case of this influence.
Tell our listeners, though, now Pacelli, who became Pius XII, had been nuncio in Germany, had been in Europe representing the Catholic Church for many, many years, ever since he was a young man. But tell us that moment, that fork in the road, when he was approached by the German resistance to become a player in this effort to assassinate Hitler.
Well, he was approached, as best we can determine from the documents, in the middle of October 1939. He probably made the decision on October 16th.
This was right after the Nazis invaded Poland.
After they invaded Poland, and they were preparing then to invade France, although it didn't happen until many months later. This was now in the stages of planning, and the German generals who had really opposed the invasion of Poland were now up in arms because they really didn't want a wider war. They wanted a negotiated truce with the West. And so they sent a very interesting lay Catholic agent who was very close to the Cardinal Archbishop of Munich, Michael Faulhaber. His name was Joseph Mueller.
And you call him Joe Ox, I believe? Joseph Ox?
His name was Joey Ox, or Derek Ox, because
he was, listen, he's the hero, next to Pius, he's the hero of this story.
He really is. He was an amazing guy. He was incredibly brave. Pius XII said that he worked wonders. He was, according to the Nazis themselves, the best agent of the Vatican intelligence service in Germany. He would fly secrets of church secrets, reports of Nazi persecutions of the church. He would put them in a briefcase, and then he would get in a single-seat sports plane and fly over the Alps from Germany to Merano, Switzerland, where he would give the reports to a contact who would take them to Pius XII in Rome. So he was a natural conduit for Hitler's opponents, and he brought an offer from Hitler's opponents to the Pope on or about October 16, 1939, saying, will you, Holy Father, serve as our foreign agent in contacts with the British to negotiate peace or pre-existing peace terms, so that when we remove Hitler and install a new government, we're sure that you won't take advantage of the chaos in Germany if there's a civil war.
So he became the guy who was going to assure the Germans who were involved in the assassination plot that Germany would be treated fairly once Hitler was done away with.
That's right, and one of the reasons they trusted the Holy Father in this respect was, as you say, he had served in Germany for nearly a decade as a papal nuncio, actually for 12 years, first in Bavaria and then in Berlin. He knew some of these German generals from riding horses with them in Berlin on the estate of a mutual friend. So there's a phenomenon here which I call secret sacred social networks, where people, Catholics or believing Christians in a situation of tyranny or dictatorship, have very trusted social connections, and the power of people informally then becomes much more important than a lot of formal structures, whether they be formal church structures or formal government structures. The idea that people behind the scenes acting on their own was very much something that Pius XII believed in, and the documents say this. So this was very much up his alley, and as you say, he wanted to take this burden upon himself. It's a radical assumption of responsibility, of moral and practical responsibility, where he said, I want this to be me and not the church. And there are various reasons for that, which I go into in the book. But one of them is that there was still a lot of anti-Catholicism, especially in British Protestants.
I noticed that their resistance to the messages being sent out from the Vatican, from the Pope, through intermediaries like Osborne.
That's right. And in the summer of 1939, where Pius was desperately trying to convene like a five-power peace conference, the British refused to participate, and I think it was the Archbishop of Westminster, the Anglican bishop, or people around him, issued very sharp rebukes about Vatican meddling in politics. And all the Pope was trying to do was convene a peace conference. So that tells you something about the different time we were in terms of ecumenism hadn't at all become respectable as it did after the war. And one of the
it's interesting, Mark, that in Germany, those Nazis, and particularly Admiral, I think Canaris is his name.
Canaris, sure.
Canaris, who was more or less the center of the resistance in Berlin. They came to see Catholics as their only real ally in this effort.
Well, certainly that's true, and there's a quote from one of the Protestant conspirators, Moltke, who tells the Jesuit provincial of Munich, he says, I tell you this as a Protestant, that I believe that Christianity and freedom in Germany can only be saved through the intercession of the Pope.
That was one of the most amazing quotes in your book. I took so many quotes, I think I filled 20 pages from your book.
Well, I tried to only, use primary sources, and I tried to keep to...
No, it's beautifully sourced, and you have something like 80 pages of notes at the end of your book.
Yeah, it's like a quarter or a third of the book. But
it's important here because there's going to be a lot of skeptics, right?
That's right, yeah.
Have you already started hearing from the skeptics?
I try not to pay too much attention to what the world says either way, because if you believe the good stuff, you have to believe the bad stuff too. So, I try to just hew to my own way, but I'm certainly expecting to have a lot of people say, well, this moves history in the wrong direction. This will make Catholics less reflective and less feeling in need of atonement for what happened.
Boy, I'll tell you, it did the opposite to me. Reading, I thought, boy, I'm a wimp. I need to get out there and make a difference.
No, I truly, I hope it's inspiring.
It's a call to heroism. It's a call to living your faith.
The Vatican issued a collection of the speeches of Pius XI under the title of A Call to Heroism in 1941, 1942, and a number of individual Catholics heeded this call. And I think it is accurate to say that this was more the struggle of individual Catholics than in the Church as an institution.
Well, except for the Jesuit order, they seem, and to some extent the Dominicans and the Benedictines, but the Jesuits in particular seem to be constantly at the forefront of your narrative. Is that correct?
Well, that's true, and certainly within Germany, the most directly active church organization was certainly the Upper Bavarian province.
And of course, Hitler hated the Jesuits for that reason, correct?
Well, he did. There's a certain Jesuitophobia that was through Europe, and there are a lot of these myths and legends and black legends about the Jesuits, and so for sure, the SS saw the Jesuits, their documents describe them as, the Pope's stormtroopers and the fiercest Romish fighting force. And the truth is that the Jesuits, certainly the Munich Jesuits, proved themselves up to this. There were three Jesuits in particular and one lay coadjutor who really were deeply, deeply involved in the second and third of the major plots to assassinate Hitler. They, at one point, even pilfered the blueprints to one of Hitler's bunkers and provided these blueprints to the assassination planners who were hoping to get in through the vents and shafts and maybe put, I'll let readers discover that themselves, but they were actually very operationally involved. They dressed in disguise. They rode the trains at night.
Well, they pretended to be, they would hang out with women and pretend to be lovers at the train station, I believe.
Right, they would promenade so that the SS would.
I mean, this has got to be a movie. I hope somebody's coming to you and offering you a lot of money for the film rights. This entire book reads like a novel. It reads like a spy thriller, and I mean that as praise because it's hard to put down. The way you begin a chapter and end a chapter, you just have to press on. And but one thing I want to establish, though, Mark, and I'm talking to Mark Riebling about his wonderful new book from Basic Books entitled Church of Spies, The Pope's Secret War Against Hitler. And by the way, those of you who like audiobooks, it's just made available on Audible. I love audiobooks myself, so I was glad to see it there.
Thank you.
Explain why he was silent. I mean, in other words, you note that I think in 1939 he was the last time he used the word Jew until the end of the war.
In public.
In public. And I think that is probably the one thing that people need to understand. Could you sort of explain that? Because you constantly come back to that in the book.
It is the sort of great mystery of the church during the war. And the simple answer is that he was advised by the church in Germany, by its leaders, as early as March 1939, during the first week after Pius was elected Pope. He received 4 German cardinals, and they were sitting down in the Vatican to plot the strategy which they would pursue toward Hitler and the Nazis under Pius XII's brand new pontificate. And the transcripts of these audiences, which we have due to the fact that Jesuit technicians bugged the meeting and made transcripts of it, they say very clearly that the German episcopate asked Pius XII not to speak out because they believed this would put German Catholics in a very difficult position, and that what might happen was that German Catholics would see themselves more as Germans than as Catholics, and would side with Hitler and the forces of the nation.
It would cause a schism.
And cause a schism, and that the church would break away, as it did under Henry VIII in England and other places. So Pius XII, exactly the opposite to how he's portrayed by some, especially John Cornwell, as this arch-centralizer who's imposing Rome's will on these recalcitrant local bishops and Catholics, instead pursues the opposite approach.
He didn't want it. He resisted it. That's not the way he wanted to go. I mean, after all, he had been the author of Mit Brennige Sorge under his predecessor, right?
That's right, and he had authored very fierce and sharp words against the Nazi regime. Although he didn't use the word Nazi, it was clear whom he meant. But after the German Catholics had to live with the resulting persecutions for a couple of years after Pius XI had spoken out in 1937, they asked Pius XII in these March 1939 meetings to ease up. They said, we need relief. It's gone from 90% of Catholics being in parochial schools to 4% or something like that.
And you point out that this was corroborated when the Dutch bishops issued a pastoral letter that led to the death of 40,000 Jews.
There was certainly a fear that any papal pronouncement would lead to an intensification of the persecutions, and Hitler himself had warned that this would happen in his speech on January 30th, 1939 to the Reichstag, where he said any foreign powers who think that by protesting what they claim are unjust methods will only find an intensification of those methods if they persist in trying to humiliate us. But
and tell our listeners what happened in Poland to Catholic priests, and it was a deliberate effort on Hitler to stamp out the church.
Well, as soon as they invaded in September 1939, they began a vicious effort led by the SS to destroy any structures of Polish society which could provide resistance to Nazi rule. And the SS decided that the main structure was the Catholic Church and individual clerics. And they did something very vicious, which was instead of going after the bishops, usually they'd go after lower clergy, and they'd put the bishops in a very difficult position, whereas if they did anything, the lives of those under them were essentially hostage. And, they shot several hundred priests in the first weeks of the occupation and shipped most of the rest off to the concentration camp at Dachau. And, as a result, the Polish church really felt that it was left to extinction. And the first cries of criticism against Pius XII were not from Jewish organizations, but they were from Polish Catholics who accused the Pope of being silent on what was happening to them, these atrocities against Catholics. And the truth is that with the exception of some remarks on Vatican radio, the Pope did refrain from publicly protesting the atrocities against Catholics in Poland. He opted, on the advice of German bishops and even some Polish bishops, to try to work behind the scenes to relieve...
To avoid further death.
To avoid further deaths and also to try and deal with the root cause. And by the way, in the United States, the Roosevelt administration pursued, in some ways, a parallel tack, in that they didn't want to portray the war as a struggle to defend European Jewry, and so they very much minimized talk about the Shoah and the Jewish victims because they didn't want to give ammunition to the isolationists. They wanted to portray it as a crusade for Christian civilization. And so there were many pressures from many different sides about how you were going to sell the war.
I'm talking to Mark Riebling about his wonderful new book, Church of Spies, The Pope's Secret War Against Hitler. We're going to talk about the actual attempts to assassinate Hitler, about Pius XII and his active role in plotting against Hitler, his actual death. The title of the book is Church of Spies, The Pope's Secret War Against Hitler. Mark, could you walk us through these various attempts to assassinate Hitler that the pontiff knew about and approved of in advance?
Well, the first attempt, which was really motivated by the German military's opposition to Hitler's planned invasion of the West, really ran from October 1939 to May 1940. And during this plot, the Pope served as an intermediary between Hitler's would-be assassins in Germany and the British government under Neville Chamberlain in London. And the thing sort of came to a climax around February 1940 when the Pope held midnight meetings in the papal apartments with Sir Darcy Osborne, who was the British ambassador to the Holy See, and really went to the mat for the German conspirators, expressing his total confidence in their ability to get rid of Hitler and in the fact that they would set up something which was not a dictatorship after Hitler had died. Mm-hmm. This was very important. London took it very seriously. There was a series of war cabinet meetings about what the Pope had put on offer. The British agreed to negotiate peace terms in advance so that the German generals would have some motivation to get rid of Hitler. And the climax of these negotiations was something called the X Report, which was written down on pieces of basically toilet paper, which the intermediary Josef Müller could swallow if he was captured. He brought them back to Germany after about 5 or 7 rounds of negotiation, and they were typed up in a spare bedroom that was used by Dietrich Bonhoeffer in Berlin, and these peace terms were presented to the German generals in April 1940, and they decided not to act for reasons basically pertaining to cowardice and personal timidity. It went to the very top of the German military, and they just thought, well, if we do this, the people won't follow us. They're too loyal to Hitler. He had just invaded Norway at that time and achieved yet another glorious victory.
Right.
And so the German generals lost their nerve. But in the wake of this, Pius XII did something that's truly extraordinary, and which I do talk about in my book as well. He then proceeded to warn the Western powers in great detail about the exact time and place of the German invasion of France and the Low Countries.
And they didn't believe them.
They didn't believe the warnings, but subsequently the Pope had a lot of credibility, and Vatican intelligence capabilities had a lot of credibility because the Pope's warnings had proved so accurate, really down to the kind of troops which would be used to take certain bridges and so forth. And this information was provided by the German conspirators as a way of trying to show that even though they didn't bring off Hitler's death, they were reliable and they could be counted on in a hoped-for second round of plots against Hitler, which did eventually materialize after Hitler had invaded Russia in 1941. And it became apparent by the end of 1941 that he was not going to capture Moscow by the end of the year, as had seemed very, very likely in the summer. And so when this happened, the German command, in a much more broad way, realized that the war was lost. And so the second round of plots came into being. And in this second round of plots, the German Jesuits, especially the Munich Jesuits, became very deeply operationally.
Yeah, they really stepped up to the plate at this point.
They really did, and they became the runners or couriers between various German officers stationed throughout Germany who had troops that they could use in a coup. And they also engaged very deeply in the planning for the post-Hitler, post-war political order.
A democratic Christian republic made up of small communities, I believe.
Yes, there was a phrase, the largest possible number of the smallest possible communities.
Yeah, which, by the way, went back to Jacques Martin's idea of the little platoons that he talked about when he was a Vatican ambassador to the Vatican.
Very much so, and in some ways it reminds me of what we have even today with people talking about growing local and being sustainable,
right. Well,
trying to...
Maritain loves Saul Alinsky. I hate to mention that on air, but he did.
That's okay. That's okay. I mean, look, let 1,000 flowers bloom, but certainly these flowers bloomed in the, the shadow of the swastika, and one of the things that the Jesuits did was to write an intended German post-war constitution based on the United States Federalist Papers, of which they were students. And from these secret political plans did come eventually something which is very close to the Christian social democracy, which ended up dominating European post-war politics in a number of countries. So that was a unique contribution which emerged from the second plots. But the second round of plots against Hitler, in which the Pope was involved, came to a head in March 1943. And at this time, the Pope had again gone as a secret foreign agent of the resistance to the English and had again negotiated informally an understanding that the Allies would not take advantage of disorder in Germany after Hitler's death. But unfortunately, the plot failed because when a time bomb was put on Hitler's plane, it froze at high altitude because the plane climbed to avoid flak. And at this higher altitude, the fuse froze, and Hitler landed safely. At this point, the plotters felt that they had to explain the failure of the plot personally to the Pope, so they decided to send Josef Mueller and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a Protestant resistant figure, to Rome to try to keep things alive. However, just at this juncture, the SS swooped in and arrested Josef Mueller, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and several other key conspirators. Basically, they beheaded the German opposition in one move. They put these people in jail and began to interrogate them, and the great fear arose in the Vatican, especially among the Pope's Jesuit advisors, that Pius XII would be directly implicated in the plotting, and it was touch and go for a while. No one knew who had talked, who had said what, how much they'd implicated the Holy Father, and so a lot of papers and things, anything possibly incriminating was, well, it became smoke that rose from Roman chimneys at this time. And it was only through the efforts of one individual Catholic, Klaus Schenk von Stauffenberg, a colonel in the German army, that the third round of plots against Hitler came together. And that then became quite exciting.
It's the one that most people know about.
That's the one about which Tom Cruise movie was made, called Valkyrie, which didn't focus on the Catholic elements of the opposition, but for Stauffenberg, this is a guy who really had, what I would call a stained glass mind. He looked very directly to the united Christendom of the Middle Ages and the time of Charlemagne and their following as a sort of lost ideal of the West. And this idea of a united Europe, or Europe united in Christian ideals, could provide a sort of counter myth to the Nazi myth, which had so many people, and even tragically so many Christians under its spell.
Is it fair to say that none of this would have happened had it not been for the explicit support of Pius XII?
Well, that may be going too far, but it certainly would not have reached the levels of intensity and credibility that it did without the support of the Holy Father. In other words, I would not say that he was either a necessary or sufficient condition, and used strictly logically. I believe there would have been plots, but he was really key in joining the foreign and domestic parts of the conspiracy. And it's a pretty radical thing if you think about it. I mean, if, let's say, there were people in Russia and they wanted to get rid of Putin, and they went to Pope Francis and they said, will you go between us and Obama? I mean, it's not a footnote to history. That's a very radical thing.
Right.
And you can imagine if you're someone in the Ukraine or in Moscow and you realize Pope Francis says he's one of us, you can imagine the galvanizing effect of how that would have on morale. And morale is extremely important in these kinds of things where you're really risking your life and perhaps your family's lives. So while it's a difficult thing to quantify logically, the testimony from the people who were involved was that it really did give a real shoot of moral juice or adrenaline to the plotting as it went forward. You
described several other plots to kill Hitler, including one in Prague. Well, actually, I want to talk a little bit about that, the successful killing of a Nazi general spy leader, the one who was closest to uncovering the Vatican involvement. You talk about, his name is Heydrich, I believe.
Yeah, Reinhard Heydrich.
And the Czech resistance successfully assassinated him, and then they fled, I think there were 7, into the cathedral at Prague where they were hiding. But they extracted from a Czech the whereabouts of them by showing him the head of his mother floating in a fish tank. It's quite macabre, yes, and these were truly evil people who would stop at nothing to intimidate their enemies. And the whole episode of the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, who was not only the SS spy chief and not only the leader of the war against political Catholicism, but he was also the architect and a real executor of the final solution, the genocide of the Jews. I didn't know that. I missed that. Yeah, his assassination was probably the single most successful covert operation in a guerrilla sense of the Second World War. Really spectacular. He was gunned down at a hairpin turn in Czechoslovakia when his driver had to brake to slow down to make the turn. He was killed by a grenade that was thrown under his car. But what was interesting to me about this was not only that the assassins had received shelter in the Cathedral of Prague, and that there was a very dramatic shootout within the cathedral, with the machine guns being, aimed down from the choir loft and so on and so forth, and then a shootout in the crypt, but that there was a pretty serious trail of Jesuits who were subsequently arrested, interrogated, and suspected for providing the support network used by the Czechs. And, a lot of that I put in a footnote in the book because I didn't want to digress the main narrative. But it's quite interesting because Josef Müller, who I've been talking about and who's really the hero of this book, he had a lot of Jesuit connections in Prague and in Bratislava or Pressburg, the Slovakian part of the former Czechoslovakia. I'm glad you brought us back to Josef Müller. Tell that story, if you can, in, next few minutes. Well, Josef Müller, Joey Ox, was the ace of papal spies. And although he was, a mild-mannered sort of book publisher who puffed a pipe and collected stamps, he was one of the most courageous people you can imagine. He was an ordinary man put in an extraordinary situation,
and he ended up being led to the gallows in April 1945. But before that, he served as the intermediary between Pius and the plotters for, about 4 years.
He made hundreds of trips to the Vatican out of Germany.
He made hundreds of trips, and he did so under the cover of German military intelligence, where the official story was that he was going to spy on the Vatican, but he was really kind of a double agent. He used his military cover to actually work for the German resistance and for what amounted to a kind of de facto papal intelligence service.
It's amazing that Himmler let him go when he brought him in.
Well, Joseph Mueller was arrested very early in the Reich in February 1934 because he was involved in efforts to expose what was going on at the first concentration camp that the SS had set up at Dachau. And he actually was able to get the first commandant of the camp fired for murdering Jews. And the Nazis didn't like this. They didn't like being embarrassed. So they called in Joseph Mueller and they interrogated him, and Himmler himself led the interrogation. And at one point, they asked Mueller, well, what were you doing when we took over in Bavaria? And what did you do to resist this? And he answered quite honestly. He said, well, I urged the then Bavarian Prime Minister to have you put up against the wall and shot. Now, no one spoke to the Nazis this way, and they were so floored by someone who wasn't cringing that they thought, well, this is a manly sort of person. This is a person who should be in the SS.
Right.
They tried to recruit him, and he said, well, nothing doing. I'm a Catholic. I couldn't possibly.
I'm a Catholic first, right.
So Himmler was just astounded. He didn't know what to do. He's flummoxed, so he let Mueller go, but he obviously ordered him to be watched. And the SS actually was convinced, absolutely convinced, and they couldn't be talked out of it, that Mueller was secretly a Jesuit who had been given a special dispensation by the Pope to marry and have children. And as evidence of this, they cited that he'd been married at the tomb of St. Peter beneath the Vatican, beneath the high altar of St. Peter's in Rome. He was married there, but he, as far as we know, certainly was not a secret Jesuit. But this goes back to the ideas which people had, crazy ideas about what the Jesuits did in Europe then. He was also very wily, crafty. He was really the Odysseus of the German resistance. He was full of so many tricks. And he was very good at jiu-jitsu, not only when the guards unshackled him so he could go to the bathroom, he'd throw them using jiu-jitsu, but he'd use verbal jiu-jitsu. He'd use people's biases against them. In one case, when they decided to say, well, was it true that you interned for a Jewish lawyer when you were just a young lawyer? And he said, oh, well, they're interested in that. Let me play that up. And so he would talk about how much he liked Jews and how great this Jewish lawyer was in order to provoke the wrath of his interrogators, and they'd lose the train of what they were really supposed to be interrogating him about. So Mueller was very good at psychology, and the SS, their records are full of remarks about how he's this unusually intrepid man of the Jesuit school, and he's extremely crafty. So I think a lot of it was his character, but in the end, Mueller was arrested, as I said, in April 1943.
How was he caught? Tell us that.
Well, he was caught because there was something that the German resistance and the Catholics in the German resistance got involved in, an operation called U7, codenamed U7, which was a rat line or a smuggling route used to exfiltrate Jews from Germany and from occupied Europe. And it was kind of an underground railroad using monasteries and convents and so on and so forth. And it wasn't a large-scale operation, but Jews who had friends in the German military used those connections to try and get themselves or their parents or whoever out in time. And Joseph Mueller was involved in securing money and in false papers for a number of these Jews, as was Father Alfred Delp, a Jesuit, and some others in the...
Another hero of your story, by the way.
Right, exactly. And unfortunately, in Joseph Mueller's case, the Prague end of this underground railroad was exposed because someone was trying to make money on the side by fencing some jewels and got arrested at the railroad station, and the Gestapo started pulling on this thread, and eventually it led back to the German military conspirators, and they were all arrested.
The last few minutes, Mark, how do you hope your book will impact the reputation of Pius XII?
Well, that's a really great question. I'd certainly like for people to think of Pius XII not as Hitler's pope, but as a pope who fought Hitler in a way which ultimately was not successful, but which was motivated by truly courageous impulses and really humanitarian impulses. He wanted peace, and he wanted peace for the whole world, and was really willing to do something brave. And because he was involved not only in plots to eliminate Hitler, but was involved in the successful overthrow of Mussolini, the Nazis did have for a time a plan to kidnap him, which did not end up going through, but which was a real plan for a while in the latter part of 1943. And Himmler even fantasized about capturing Pius XII and bringing him to Berlin and having him publicly executed to celebrate the opening of a new soccer stadium. So this is an important part of this pope and his controversial legacy. I know that there's an issue in terms of whether or not or when Pius XII will be made a saint. I try to stay out of these debates, which are really for the people in the Vatican who are involved with these things to decide upon, sort of in the same way that the Baseball Hall of Fame has to decide whether or not they're going to put Pete Rose in. You can have your opinion as a fan, but it's really the responsibility of the people in the organization. I do think it's important for our Jewish brethren to understand that the description Hitler's Pope is really scandalously false, and it's even false for those who would read John Cornwell's book, Hitler's Pope. Church of Spies is, I think, an important corrective and really does position Pius XII where he belongs. He belongs, really, he's much more Churchill's Pope and Roosevelt's Pope than he was Hitler's Pope. But he was really the Pope of those who wanted a sort of an example and really inspiration and assistance in trying to do something which would actually have gone to the root of the problem. And frankly, if Pius XII had been arrested and executed for his role in the plots, as, say, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was, we wouldn't ever have considered calling him Hitler's Pope. And so, whether the plot succeeded or failed was not the fault of Pius XII. And so we shouldn't evaluate him for the success or failure of something which didn't depend on him personally. We should only evaluate him for what he actually did do. And I think in that light, history over time will take a much kinder, warmer, and more sensible view of this very controversial pope.
Mark Riebling, I want to thank you for writing your wonderful book, Church of Spies, and I ask all of our listeners to take a look. Mark Riebling, Church of Spies. It's on Amazon. It's everywhere. It's on audiobook. And Mark, I hope that when the dust settles over your book, that you can come back on the show. We can talk some more.
I'd love to. It's been a great honor and pleasure. Thank you so much, Steele.
Thank you, Mark.